Recently, Nintendo announced that Animal Crossing Pocket Camp, Animal Crossing's debut on mobile services, would be shutting down its servers this coming November. This isn't really unusual. Nintendo has already had 3 mobile services, Dr. Mario World, Dragalia Lost, and Miitomo, which have been taken offline and become unplayable in the past. What makes Pocket Camp a little different, however, is that it isn't going to become unplayable. In its place, Nintendo are releasing a paid offline version called Animal Crossing Pocket Camp Complete. The name may be a little misleading, as not every feature from the online version will be available, but the vast majority of it will be, and there's even going to be a feature that allows you to transfer your save data from vanilla Pocket Camp to Complete, although it requires you to have linked your profile to a Nintendo account before the game is taken down. I have a great affection for Animal Crossing, as I've played Wild World, New Leaf and New Horizons a significant amount in the past, but beyond a quick look when it was released, I haven't played Pocket Camp. Well, until trying to capture footage for this video, that is. So this announcement doesn't affect me directly, as cool as it is that Nintendo has put so much effort into preserving their players' experiences. But that itself is weird, right? Other than the prospect of being able to make more money from a paid download, a strategy Nintendo themselves had to abandon the first time they tried it on mobile devices, what does Nintendo gain from this? Well, I think this is another step in their battle to wipe emulation off the face of the earth. Yeah, we're going to Conspiracy Town today, guys, so get comfy because I have a lot to get through today and it's gonna go places. It seems pretty clear to me that Nintendo is basically done with mobile gaming. They started off strong, releasing 2 games or apps almost every year for a while. In 2016, we got the Mii-based social media app Miitomo, which you should be able to guess I adored given my profile picture is from that service. Unfortunately, it only lasted 2 years before being discontinued. We also got Super Mario Run, which is the only one to actually have a price tag attached to being able to play more than the first 4 levels. An unusual strategy, but the game is still plodding along and even getting new content relatively recently. Also, note that I'm not including Pokemon games like Pokemon Go and Unite, as these are the Pokemon companies doing, not Nintendo's. In 2017, we got Pocket Camp itself and Fire Emblem Heroes, which brought in crazy revenue numbers for, I don't know, not sure why this game of all games made them so much money. Both are still around, although as I've mentioned, Pocket Camp is kicking the bucket this November. 2018 was seemingly a slow year for Nintendo's mobile output, but despite that, they still had a game out and it was actually a pretty interesting one, Dragalia Lost. That's right, there is a Nintendo franchise exclusive to mobile devices, which I think is pretty cool, other than the fact that it's now been shut down as of 2 years ago. 2019 brought with it Dr. Mario World and Mario Kart Tour, my beloved. Mario Kart Tour's potential shutdown has been a fairly big topic of conversation, as the game has already stopped getting new updates as of October last year, and many speculate that this will inevitably be followed by the overall shutdown of the game at some point, although this is yet to be confirmed. As for Dr. Mario World, that only lasted until October 2021, and is that really a surprise? Dr. Mario isn't exactly a heavy hitter, although I feel like it was worth it just for giving us Dr. Dolphin. 2019 was 5 years ago now, and in the time since, only a single game has been released, that being Nintendo's collaboration with Niantic, Pikmin Bloom, back in 2021. It's very similar to Pokemon Go, but Go itself works so well because Pokemon's central hook is so strong and fits the model insanely well. None of Niantic's other games have been anywhere near as popular as Pokemon Go, nor have they been as engaging in my opinion. On doing some research, my suspicions that Nintendo has exited the market were confirmed. Apparently they cited COVID as a reason for this, but also how strong their console business was. And realistically, while there is a lot of money to be made in mobile gaming, the level that Nintendo operates in the console market simply has more money attached to it. A lot more. Allow me to put some mathematics into this video. The latest numbers I could find on Mario Kart Tour's revenue put it at $250 million. That's not to be sniffed at for sure. But then what about their console counterpart? Well, Mario Kart Tour released in September 2019, so let's see what the sales numbers for Mario Kart 8 Deluxe were between Q2 reports in 2019 and 2023. In October, it was reported that Mario Kart 8 Deluxe had sold 28.99 million copies. In October 2023, it was reported that it had sold 57.01 million units. That's almost 30 million copies within that period. Now, let's assume the $60 price tag is attached to it. This would mean that Nintendo made $1.8 billion of revenue through Mario Kart 8 Deluxe sales alone. That is insane numbers, no matter what way you look at it. Now, of course, that's revenue, not profit, although frankly I don't think there's much you can do to justify that 8 Deluxe, which has made over 7 times the revenue that Tour did within the same period, was somehow less profitable. And that's especially given that of the two games, Tour is the one that had to have active development for basically that entire time, while Deluxe only had the BCP. This number also doesn't include any of the money Deluxe made from, for example, DLC, nor does it include any revenue 8 Deluxe pushed through people buying Switches to play the game on, especially given the amount of bundles Nintendo has released with it, or how many NSO subscriptions the BCP pushed. I would imagine the actual revenue the game has generated is in excess of $2 billion, but for Tour we know it only made $250 million, because the number given for it includes all its microtransactions, and it's a mobile game, so it doesn't push sales of the Switch or 8 Deluxe itself nearly as effectively. Obviously, not every game is Mario Kart, and I would imagine that Fire Emblem Heroes made more money than any Fire Emblem game ever has, considering it's the highest selling mobile game Nintendo actually has. But this should still show that Nintendo is such a juggernaut in the console business that mobile gaming is actually generally not as profitable a prospect as you might think. So realistically, I don't think COVID had that much to do with it. Nintendo was always going to leave the mobile game business sooner or later. But this only answers the question of why Pocket Camp is going away, not why they would offer an active replacement. Well, this is where the tinfoil hat comes out, because I have had a theory for a long time that Nintendo is putting a lot of effort into preservation of their games. Mobile games like this often require an active internet connection, and that means that they require servers to be kept open for them, which have to be maintained and updated over time. This could get quite costly, meaning eventually it just makes sense for them to be shut down. This is similar to why games like Pac-Man 99 and services like the Wii, DS, 3DS and Wii U online services have had to be shut down. Once it's no longer providing enough profit to justify keeping them online, well, they don't keep them online. Releasing Pocket Camp Complete means they can justify shutting the game down while not actually taking the game away. Sure, it won't be exactly the same, but just as with something like Mario Kart DS Now, you still have the bulk of the content there for you, just not the online portion. In this way, they are able to preserve this game. It no longer becomes a piece of lost media. I think that's great, as video game preservation is one of the most hotly debated topics of the modern age, with Nintendo typically being the big bad wolf who's trying to take down emulation sites, which are often providing the only way to play these games. To see Nintendo putting their own effort into preservation is actually really nice. What does this mean for the other mobile games? That's kinda unclear, but I can absolutely see mobile versions of some of the other games being created. Dragalia Lost almost seems a certainty to me, and Dr. Mario World could have something similar too. I doubt Miitomo or Pikmin Bloom would be feasible, the former requiring interaction with other players, and the latter being tied way too fundamentally to using your phone's GPS, but even something like Fire Emblem Heroes seems feasible. The big question mark I would have is Mario Kart Tour. The majority of the game is played against computer players anyway, so making a version that takes away the ranking element and the online play and puts the focus on the gameplay and the tours themselves would actually work really well as an offline game. Here's the issue. There is so much content in Tour that it would be nigh impossible to have it all on a mobile device. Seriously, while technically there are 136 different courses in the game, and I say the word only very lightly there because 136 isn't a small amount, that's only half the story, because almost every single course has 4 different variants. A regular variant, a reverse variant, a trick variant, and a reverse trick variant. Counting all these variants together, you end up with a whopping 541 different variants, which will obviously all be stored differently internally. In the game as it is, each tour you have to do a big download to get the courses from the current tour and uninstall the ones from the previous tour, but an offline version wouldn't have that luxury. That is crazy levels of content, and expecting this to all be stuffed into one mobile device without causing severe issues is kinda insane. It does, however, make me hope that someday, maybe, we'll get a console version of Tour, which would probably be more feasible to have all that content without the need for downloads, but that's a pipe dream. Either way, I do think Pocket Camp indicates a move towards preserving games that are otherwise unplayable or will be someday. But I think there are other indications of this intent in things Nintendo is doing. Don't believe me? Well, just look at NSO. They've been steadily drip feeding content onto the service ever since it released, and we're at the point now where almost every notable Nintendo game released on the NES, and many other NES games too, are on the service. The same is becoming more true over time for the SNES too, and it's admittedly slower going for the other consoles, but it does seem to me that they are really trying to make these services a complete library of their games. They don't want any stone to be unturned, and they want no game to be forgotten. They want to make every single game they have ever released available if possible. And not just that, but also every version of every game they've ever released. It has not escaped my personal glance that there are multiple versions of several games on the Switch. The most obvious is arguably the fact that Super Mario 64 is on NSO despite also being available through 3D All-Stars. The big rebuttal to this is the fact that 3D All-Stars is not indeed available anymore, but I still find it interesting given that 64 was almost completely untouched in this version, so it isn't as if you're getting a fundamentally different experience from the two versions. I also find it interesting that both Link's Awakening DX and Pokemon Mystery Dungeons have versions on NSO, despite also having remakes on the Switch as well. And more to the point, I find it interesting that the NSO versions released after the remakes. I don't know if the remakes are considered to be superior, but both were very well received, so there doesn't appear to be much of a reason for Nintendo to put the originals on that service at this point. Either people won't care because they can play the remakes, or they'll play the original on NSO instead of the remake that Nintendo charges a pretty penny for. Doesn't seem like it has much of a purpose for Nintendo specifically, beyond preservation of those old games. But the thing that really sparked this in my mind was the Super Mario Advance games. Super Mario Bros. 3's Advance version was released with the GBA service, and that made sense to add because it also came with the e-reader levels. But then, at a later date, the other Advance versions were also added, and this made no sense to me because there's already a version of Super Mario Bros. 2, Yoshi's Island, and Super Mario World on the Switch. Heck, not even just on the Switch, on the Switch Online service. Heck, not even just that, on the base Switch Online package that everyone with the expansion that the Advance games are on will already have access to. And these games, while certainly not exactly the same as the games they're based on, certainly don't have enough in them to justify a separate release, beyond featuring Mario Bros as an optional game to play as well. Another game that's already on the Switch Online service. Now, don't get me wrong, I was elated at this. Super Mario World is my third favourite game of all time, and one of the first video games I ever played, but it was the GBA version that I actually played way back then, so being able to play this specific version made me so happy, and it's still the version I'll play if I want to look to get my world fix. However, is that really worth it to Nintendo? Making people in my very specific case happy? I don't know, seems a fairly weak reason from Nintendo's point of view. The only real explanation to me is that they're trying to build the NSO content to a point where, yes, all these different versions of their games will become available. There are other little hints of this, although subtle. For example, there's the fact that the Virtual Boy featured at the Nintendo Museum appears to be running on an emulator through a Switch. Could this mean that at some point we'll see a Virtual Boy app released for NSO? Then there's the fact that recently, F-099 got courses added to it from the Satellaview version of the game. That's a heck of a deep cut, and a really random one to suddenly make. Heck, even with the Nintendo World Championship game, they added the ability to choose your favourite NES game, and literally every NES game ever released was listed. Nintendo seems to be really trying to remember the past in a big way at the moment. So when all of this is said and done, what can we expect from the future? Obviously this is entirely speculation, but I think we're going to see more of this stuff happening. More obscure content or things that are currently unplayable or difficult to obtain being brought to a modern audience. There is so much that could be done here. Virtual Boy games seem relatively likely, but what about Satellaview games? There are some games entirely lost to history because the Satellaview obviously doesn't exist anymore, but does that have to remain the case? I think not. I would imagine they'll find a way to preserve light gun games that are pretty difficult to emulate given they require a CRT screen to work. What about the arcade titles? What about the CDI games? What about bringing back Super Mario Bros. 35, my other beloved? As I mentioned in my Switch 2 prediction video, I could absolutely see them creating NSO apps for DS, GameCube, Wii and 3DS, and heck, someday I could even see them doing that for the Wii U, although maybe not on the next console. And sure, it does seem like the Switch's eShop is going to continue onto later consoles, which means games like For example, Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze will be available forever on the future consoles. So why would they ever do an NSO app for Wii U? Because I can just play the Switch version. Except I can't because I never bought that version. It seems to me that they could make it a fairly simple choice. You can either buy the remade or remastered version of these games, or you can play the original version on NSO without all the fancy new features. No new funky mode for you if you choose that option, but it would still make that game available to you, and besides, it's not like Tropical Freeze is going to sell much more anyway at this point, especially if they ever actually make another Donkey Kong Country game. But what makes me personally more excited about this is for the super obscure content. You ever heard of the game Bonsai Barber? Nah, neither had I until I started to get interested in the world of obscure Nintendo games. This game is no longer available, as it was released exclusively for the Wii eShop, but if we end up getting a Wii version of the NSO apps, then who knows, maybe Bonsai Barber will end up being on the list. But for me it goes even deeper than that, because there is a set of games that are so obscure and barely known that you cannot even find video footage of them online. These are the Nintendo Game Seminar games. I'm planning to do a video on them next year to go fully in depth, but the idea is that between the mid-2000s and the mid-2010s, Nintendo held a yearly game seminar which allowed students in groups to create their own games, which Nintendo themselves would actually end up releasing. Only issue is that the way they were released was very limited. Firstly, it was barely marketed at all, so pretty much no one knew about them. Secondly, they were only released in Japan, and in order to get the games you had to go to a DS download station to get them. This is exclusively for the ones released on the DS. The ones on the Wii U were released on the eShop. And for those DS ones, they were only available for a pitiful 2 weeks. What has resulted is that these are not only undeniably the most obscure and underpreserved Nintendo games of all time, but some of the most obscure and underpreserved games of all time in general. I have looked hard for ROMs of these games, and granted, I have found some success, but many of them are still completely impossible to play in any way. But it gets even worse than that, because many of them don't even have any gameplay footage available online. I've looked literally everywhere, but games like Bayou just have nothing. The only way we know anything about these games is because we have a limited amount of screenshots, and there's also a couple of reviews for some of them. They aren't just lost media, they aren't even just forgotten media. This media barely existed in people's minds in the first place, and that's so incredibly sad to me. Heck, I can't even find people talking about these games. If you tried to look these games up, any way you could see someone talking about these games within the last 10 years is probably from me. I've tried so hard to ask in various places for information, or just to spark some sort of conversation about them, but no one really seems interested. Heck, the only conversation I've ever had is with one of the actual creators of one of the games offered, someone who clearly loves the game they created and remembers it fondly, who revealed to me that he himself, the person who made the game, is completely unable to play it. That's actually kind of ridiculous. I hope my passion for these games is coming through because I'm pretty damn passionate about them. But if Nintendo actually went ahead and made these games properly available on a modern console, I actually think I'd cry, and I'm not kidding. This is the kind of preservation that only Nintendo can do, and I pray that someday they do dive into the DS and Wii U libraries on NSO, because that would mean these games could finally get a slice of the love they deserve. Through this video, I've tried to demonstrate the evidence that Nintendo is putting special effort into the preservation of their games. But there still remains that ever-elusive question. Why? Well, I think it's pretty simple. Nintendo really hates emulation. My stance on emulation is possibly surprisingly neutral, and I almost never do it. The only exceptions being when I'm trying to do a randomized Nuzlocke on a Pokemon game, or when I was trying to play the aforementioned game seminar games. I think this mostly comes down to a fundamental character trait I have, where I just don't like to do anything I view as breaking the rules, and playing a game without purchasing it in some way feels like that to me. But I also know that emulation is an important part of the video game preservation process, and through my interest in the game seminar games, I've seen just how crucial that really is. Nintendo, on the other hand, they don't like it at all. And I would imagine that the basic reasoning would be that if people emulate games, they're likely to emulate new games, as it's a way for them to get the games for free, and that means emulation loses the money, and people overall seem to agree that piracy is not okay. But as long as emulation exists, then so will piracy. and Nintendo doesn't want that. Putting this effort into making every version of every game they have ever made available would seem, to me at least, to be a way to try to allow themselves more power to go after emulation and stop it wherever possible. Nintendo is notorious for this, despite the fact that they don't actually do it as much as most people think, but this is likely because most of the time they'd be faced with much more of a struggle than would be worth it. After all, while piracy is an issue, if a game isn't available through Nintendo themselves, then why would taking it down be a benefit to them? It would be hard to justify. If, however, all their games are made available on modern consoles, then they can easily justify that any emulation of their games is piracy. That, I would imagine, would make it much easier for them to be able to shut down emulation sites and services. I know this sounds like a bit of a downer. The big capitalist wheel turning and favouring a large company, as is unfortunately far too common. However, I don't actually feel as negative about it because this is actually addressing the primary issue that fans have. The reason emulation is so prevalent and the issue people have with Nintendo is the lack of preservation that exists for all their games. If Nintendo actually goes through with this, as I feel they're trying to do, it isn't just them throwing their weight around to crush the people below them, although there is an element of that, but it's actually solving the issue people have in a pretty fundamental way. I see more of a net positive in that situation than anything, honestly, especially as there's only so much the emulation community can actually do, as evidenced by how many of the game's seminar games are completely lost. If Nintendo actually did this, I think I would be very happy actually. I know this video is a bit all over the place and I jumped to a lot of conclusions, but I just had to make it after seeing the video on Pocket Camp's end of service plans. It feels like yet another piece of the puzzle I've seen forming over the last few years, and I really wanted to shine a light on that because I think it's incredibly interesting to consider and potentially really exciting if I'm right. Let's just wait and see what the future brings. Hopefully a way for me to play Nekasoggy Tornado.